Just finished watching Cameron Bertuzzi's interview with Philip Goff, chronicling Goff's conversion to Christianity as an academic philosopher and previously an atheist. I'm going to link it below. It's a great view. You should check it out. I'm going to give you now my quick thoughts on the interview. First of all, I think whenever people have this high profile conversion being announced, then there's always a lot of interest. And I think also a lot of pushback and disappointment. When Antony Flew 20 years ago converted to theism, that got a lot of attention as he was a very famous atheist. But I think a lot of Christians were dissatisfied as well that he had not converted to Christianity, but rather to theism. And atheists were dissatisfied because he had abandoned what they believed to be true and important beliefs as well. And I think often that's what happens is that the person who has a conversion doesn't end up satisfying, in a sense, either side. And I suspect that'll, to some degree, be the case here. Goff has this conversion. It's not going to be satisfactory to most atheists, I would think, who think that he made some serious mistakes and wrong turns, although they may respect his process of reasoning. It's also not going to satisfy many Christians because, as Cameron says at the beginning of the interview, quote, it's a very unique version of Christianity. And Goff himself explains right away what that means by quickly saying, well, see, he doesn't believe in the virgin birth. He doesn't believe that God is omnipotent. He believes the Bible has errors, and he is not certain about his convictions. In fact, later in the interview, he describes faith, I think correctly so, as essentially trust. But he places that sort of threshold that trust is perhaps about a 30% conviction of the likelihood of something being true. At that point, the rationality of trust may kick in somewhere around there. And so you're kind of thinking Goff is in the maybe less than 50% in terms of his convictions of Christianity being true. Having said that, at the end of the interview, he says he currently goes to an Anglican church because it is a big tent. It is famously, as a theological tradition, known for what is called the spirit of comprehension, which is to encompass people with many different doctrinal views and degrees of conviction about those views. So I think Anglicanism historically is and has been a very welcoming place for people that find themselves sort of on the perimeter of or periphery of belief. Interesting question. Why Christianity? And this question doesn't really get explored until the end of the interview, which I thought was a little unusual. I would have wanted myself to consider this more early on. And I think the answer as to why Christianity is so first of all, Goff became convinced that, well, not convinced, he became persuaded on the balance of probabilities or something like that, much more modest, that there is good evidence for the existence of God, particularly in the evidence for cosmic fine tuning. But the problem of evil was for him sufficiently and remains sufficiently problematic that he cannot conceive God being omnipotent. So he believes God is finite in power. And so we'll just talk about that for a minute. Um, what really didn't get explored here a lot is how that catches out. For example, so God cannot prevent a child from dying of cancer. Um, well, what God cannot prevent me from tripping and scraping my knee? To what degree is God lacking in power? And I would be interested to hear from Goff, since he references praying at the end of the interview, both talking about sort of a listening prayer and then a talking prayer, one in the morning, one in the evening. I'd be interested to know in what sense he has a life of petitionary prayer, where he asks God to bring about certain states of affairs. Because if to what degree does Goff believe God even has the power to act in the world at all? Because the second that God has some degree of power to act, then you have the problem of evil arising for evils that occur at the level of power at which God acts, which he could have prevented. So I'd be interested to hear more about that. The fact that he rejects, I'm kind of bouncing around here a bit, so my apologies for that. Maybe I'll come back to Christianity in a minute, but I'll just want to say more about theism and then come back to the choice of Christianity. Another thing about this idea of God lacking power, which didn't get really explored in the interview, not a criticism, you can only talk about so much in an hour and a bit, but is for me really central for this conversation, which is the divine aseity institution, the divine aseity intuition. and related to that, the perfect being intuition. In other words, the idea that God would be a perfect being. Now, they do talk about that as being a simple hypothesis and so on, but I think there's more to be explored here in terms of the strength of that, and to raise the question of at what degree does God, who lacks perfection or power, become worship worthy? And what does worship even mean on this account? So, those are interesting questions at the very least. Um, and and then the divine aseity intuition. So if God's not all powerful, did God create the universe? If so, what does that mean for God to have created the universe? Did God form preformed material existence, a substrate that exists independently of God, so that God is not ase, the source of being, the being of all other things, existing independently in himself? What does that look like? I'd just be interested to hear more about how Goff understands the doctrine of God given these qualifications. Now, the question to move to Christianity. Yeah, so I said this gets discussed at the end of the interview. I would have found it interesting to discuss it earlier on. Uh, so at the beginning, again, Goff doesn't believe in the virgin birth, and I know Christians are going to be very unhappy about that. First thing I want to say is Emil Brunner didn't believe in the virgin birth. Wolfhard Pannenberg didn't believe in the virgin birth. If you don't know who those folks are, those are two of the leading Protestant theologians of the 20th century. I don't think they were right about that, but I wouldn't question their theological credentials as Christian theologians. I think they took a wrong turn. But there's an interesting question here, right, at the center of all this about what does it even mean to be a Christian? What beliefs do you have to be a Christian? I'll want to come back to that, but I I'm not particularly perturbed by the fact that Goff doesn't accept the virgin birth, doesn't accept an omnipotent God, that he doesn't accept biblical inerrancy as conservative Christians hold it. Certainly have no problem with that. And that he's not certain about his convictions. In fact, I don't think certainty should be an expectation for many Christians. And I do want to just come back to the comment Cameron made about Philip Goff having a quote, very unique version of Christianity. I'm going to say this: any Christian who really takes the doctrines and the creeds seriously and thinks through step by step what they believe about all these different issues will likely themselves arrive at quote a very unique version of Christianity. Because once you get beyond just the rote percent to creeds publicly recited and you actually get down to fleshing out what a particular doctrine means or how it should be understood, that's where you get the blooming buzzing confusion of a million different interpretations of X or Y or Z, and you get all the uniqueness that defines Christianity. So I don't think that we should penalize people for thinking carefully about their Christian beliefs and taking them seriously in a way that the vast majority of Christians do not. Imagine that you go into the typical church pew, church congregation on Sunday morning, go up to someone in the pew and ask them, tell me what you believe about the doctrine of God. Do you think that they're going to articulate a clearly orthodox and coherent understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity and the divine attributes? 99% of the time, they won't. 99% of the time, they will have a garbled, confused understanding of what it is they profess to believe, which itself is, quote, a very unique version of Christianity. So let's be careful about acting in a punitive, judgmental manner toward people who are carefully, with integrity, thinking through what it is they believe about various doctrines. Let's not shoot the messenger, as it were, and discourage critical thought and reflection. Now, the big question, why Christianity versus some other religion? And the big answer kind of seems to be because this is what Goff is most familiar with. First of all, he grew up Catholic, and so I guess it made sense for him to return to a Christian tradition, although again, he returned to an Anglican one. But given the fact that he thinks there is very likely a non-omnipotent God, it made sense to adopt a theological picture of the world, which is consistent with a non-omnipotent God. And so he's working with the Christian one. They talk about the atonement, and here the focus is on the fact that Goff doesn't accept a penal substitutionary account of atonement, but rather what he calls a participatory account. And he cites Robin Collins as an example of someone who articulates this view. I mean, that's fine. The one thing I would want to emphasize here is, which does get addressed somewhat in the interview, is that Christianity as such, mere Christianity, has never been committed to a particular theory of atonement. What Christianity commits one to is the doctrine of atonement, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, not any specific theory of how to understand that process of incarnation, restorative death, and reconciliation and restoration of creation. The same thing, of course, with like the doctrine of the Trinity. You don't have to believe a theory of what the doctrine of the Trinity is, how it should be understood, in order to assent to the doctrine of the Trinity. Theories are another level of abstraction. That's where you get into what we call the adiaphora, which is things that are disputable matters, how to interpret, theorize about the various doctrines that form the confessions of faith. There is this conversation in the interview about the nature of faith itself, and Goff depends heavily on the idea of faith as trust and sort of places it at a 30% level, reasonably assuming that you have to have some reasonable openness to this belief being true in order for you to have sufficient grounds to place rational trust in it and act upon it accordingly. What faith does not require, on his view, is certainty. You don't have to be certain of things. You just have to have an adequate ground for trust. And he kind of throws out this 30% likelihood of being true as sufficient ground to exercise trust. I would want to even go a little further here and say you can even go further than trust and say you could have a ground for faith simply in terms of hope. And hope doesn't require 30%. Hope just requires the barest of possibilities. And I like to give this illustration. Imagine that you buy a lottery ticket for a lottery. And so it's $1 million if you win, and there were, let's say, 1 million tickets sold. And so the likelihood of you winning on your one ticket is 1 million to 1. But even though it's 1 million to 1, it's only the tiniest of chances that you'll win. You ought to hope that you will win. And that makes sense, right? Because surely if you buy the ticket, you ought to hope that you'll get that $1 million lottery. And if you look at Christianity and you think, wow, this is a worldview that I hope to be true. Well, then the next question is, can I live as if it's true? And if you can, then to me, that's exercising a kind of faith where you say, I'm not, I don't, maybe it's even 1 million to 1, but I hope it's true, and I'm going to live as if it's true. And added benefits along the way is if doing so brings you added pleasure and joy as living as a Christian in a healthy Christian community and seeking to love one's neighbor as oneself, that can bring about an increased um, enjoyment of life itself. That's just an added benefit along with the 1 million to 1 odds of you thinking it is true, but simply nonetheless hoping it's true. And I'm certainly one who thinks a God who exists would commend that kind of action because we don't have control over the degree of conviction directly as to the likelihood of something being true. We can't control our beliefs. We don't have that doxastic voluntarist power over our degree of conviction directly. But what we can do is we can control our actions, our patterns of behavior, and you can live with the hope that Christianity is true, even if you think it's 1 million to 1 odds that it is true. Maybe the last thing I'm going to just talk about, maybe two things. One thing that didn't really get addressed at all was eternity, particularly the understanding of the quote unquote heaven or the new heavens and new earth and hell, and how we should understand a doctrine of posthumous judgment on Goff's view. I'd be really interested to hear what that is like on his view. All that he does talk about, which is still nonetheless significant, is how his different view of the resurrection of Jesus would have implications potentially for how we understand the resurrection body. One thing about the resurrection of Jesus that he does mention is he believes there was a real resurrection, but not a physical bodily one. Yeah, rather, he takes from Dale Allison a view that there was Jesus had a sort of spiritual body, but even so, the tomb was empty. And one of the things I was wondering when he described this view, which I'm not that familiar with, is what is the relationship between the physical body that was laid in the tomb on Friday and the person that was subsequently seen in post-resurrection appearances? Is there a one-to-one correlation there? So that in the material that constituted the body laid in the tomb, was reconstituted with a new spiritual reality that was seen through these visions? Or was that old body vaporized or something and just ceased to exist and a new body replaced it? I'd have more problems in terms of the orthodoxy of that second view than the first view that there was just a more radical transformation of the body. And that would go back to explaining why the tomb was found empty on this view. Okay, the last thing I just want to talk about is one thing I want to push back a little bit on is both Cameron and Philip Goff have this little bit of a binary way of talking about Christianity being true as yes or no, right? Well, is Christianity true or not? Will it be shown to be true? Will it not? And the one thing I would just want to point out is when a person says Christianity is true, what they're saying is typically a complex, long list of beliefs and practices that they believe to be true is true. And it's not clear at what point the falsity of the various components of that long list would be sufficient to make the overall list not true. In other words, if I am what we could call an Orthodox Christian, but I end up being wrong about the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the Incarnation or something, but everything else is still true. Maybe God is a monad who revealed Jesus as his human prophet. Would that be Christianity now that was true, or would that just be a different thing? And what was Christianity, as I believe it, is just false. And I think we have the reality is here, it's not clear when the degree of falsity in our current beliefs would be such sufficient to say that the overall set of beliefs is false. So that we have to be careful about talking about Christianity in a binary sense as either being true or false, because it may be, and probably likely will be the case, that Christianity, as we currently understand it, will be more or less true, because it's very unlikely that all of the beliefs that any one of us currently holds about Christianity is likely to be true.